And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hydepark on Derana 24. Tonight, we will be talking about security threats, counter-terrorism opportunities for cooperation and communication among the global south and the west, and how Sri Lanka can be a strategic hotspot and play a major role in cooperation in South Asia. I've invited to our studios Professor Christian Kaunert, Professor in International Security and Counter-Terrorism. A very warm welcome to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here.
Certainly. We'd like to talk to you about security opportunities really for cooperation. But before that, let's maybe dive into what threats we face as a country first. I know you specialize in EU affairs and the global south. In your understanding, how would you analyze Sri Lanka's situation?
Yes, I think Sri Lanka's situation is really part of the wider region, right? Sri Lanka is really at the heart of the region. 70% of world trade goes through Sri Lanka and through Colombo port in particular. It's a very vital and important part of the global economy, of global security and so on. So because of that, it is also vital to ensure continued security, because anything that happens here in Colombo, anything that happens in Sri Lanka has wider implications as far as Europe. Even though Europe might be far geographically, it isn't far when it comes to security threats. So when we look at the situation broadly, we can certainly see that terrorism is, of course, something that is a painful memory for Sri Lanka. It is something that Sri Lanka has learned very important lessons that are not just for Sri Lanka, but in fact also for the wider world, for Europe in specific. And in terms of the threats that we face, consequently, they have evolved over time. So what we still face, globally speaking, and therefore also here, are, of course, continued political violence, continued threats of possible Islamist terrorism. We see ever changes in Islamist terrorism. We see technological changes. We see increased use of drones. We see AI increasingly being used in terrorism. We use cyber dimension that is becoming very important when it comes to terrorism and terrorist threats. So all of these dimensions generally provide us with vulnerabilities. Now, that's not to say that they are necessarily more particular to Sri Lanka than they are to the wider region, but those threats exist, and as they exist in the wider region, they invariably are also threats to Sri Lanka. In addition to that, we see increasingly also disinformation campaigns. We see increased use of hybrid warfare. That is something that in Europe we've studied already for a number of years. That is something that we're seeing increasingly also in South Asia. So that is something of a future threat that perhaps we need to be more wary of. But in general, we are dealing with a situation that is relatively stable. We are dealing with a situation that is, in a sense, providing Sri Lanka and anchoring the global south, as it were, here, and through that providing a lot of stability for all the littoral states of the region. And I think that's a very good thing. And I think Sri Lanka is really a very important partner for Europe and the international community more generally in that.
You mentioned a future threat that we have to be cautious about. If you can maybe give us more detail.
Yeah, so what we're seeing here in terms of future threats, in particular when it comes to hybrid warfare and when it comes to disinformation campaigns, what we're seeing here is the increased use of them, sometimes by external actors, to insert themselves into the domestic politics of sometimes smaller country, medium-sized countries, sometimes even big countries. So even in the West, we've seen a number of different campaigns. Sometimes those campaigns that occur in the online space, we will see them also having kinetic dimensions. So we might see terror attacks that come in addition to the disinformation campaigns. we see technological possibilities of disinformation that we didn't used to see a number of years ago. So nowadays you could see AI fakes, videos, pictures that are not real, and that can be used in disinformation campaigns where it's very difficult immediately to verify the veracity of the information that is being provided, and all of that with the intent to undermine democratic systems, to undermine stability, and as a consequence for external actors to somehow insert themselves into that domestic political system.
You spoke about these threats, but what radicalization trends do you really see, Professor, as we step into a period of global wars and threats, migration increasingly, and also many ideologies, but regrouping, if I may say. I'm sure you can give me an academic explanation here, but what trends in terms of radicalization do you perceive?
So there's a broad menu really here of threats in terms of radicalization. The first one is, of course, the threat of Islamist radicalization. We've seen it in various countries in Europe. We've seen, for instance, in Germany, if I just take that as an example, we saw the general election campaign in Germany that happened this year. And in the run of the German election campaign, we saw a number of terror attacks that came via Islamist radicalization. That had a significant impact also on the election campaign. A lot of campaigning was then related to some of those terror attacks. Since the election has been concluded, we've seen far less in terms of those terror attacks. So that is something also to bear in mind. So that threat continues to exist. We also see threats in terms of far-right radicalization. We see threats in terms of a kind of a la carte radicalization. So what we're seeing increasingly is also self-radicalization of individuals. So self-radicalizations of youngsters that perhaps watch it on their computers, embedded in their gaming systems and a number of other kind of activities that are not ideologically coherent anymore, something that is quite new actually. Ideological coherence was one of the past where we used to see perhaps Islamist radicalization, far left radicalization, far right radicalization, various forms of radicalization. Nowadays we see a kind of a la carte menu radicalization where youngsters might be radicalized with some elements of Islamist thinking, some elements of far right and far left thinking all happening at the same time, and that then when they conclude some of their activities, they don't have a clear ideology that drives it necessarily anymore. Linked to that is also the increasing use of remote radicalization, I might call it, remote radicalization through external actors in the domestic societies of individual countries, actors that are not locally even present in those societies, that through the use of internet and through the use of gaming are then able to radicalize individuals and sometimes steer individuals within those societies. And that is something of a big concern that we have.
But that's a real threat today in today's context. Moving back to Sri Lanka, Professor Kaunert, Easter Sunday attacks of 2019 shocked not just the country but the world. But this was not only because of the gruesome violence, but also because of the catastrophic intelligence sharing, communications, failures or weaknesses that we saw. So how do you really see the connection between intelligence, the political authority, and the intelligence network here, and also establishing a strong communication setup here, or even politically a security conscious administration? We'll talk about Sri Lanka here so that we safeguard a country from potential threats.
Yes, yes. Well, let me start first by commemorating the victims. I think this was a very, very painful attack, and it's very important to commemorate the victims and to empathize with the pain that all their families will have gone through. So I think I want to start with that. Now, when it comes to the attacks, I mean, I've spent a little bit of time now in Sri Lanka, and I've had a number of engagements with the military political hierarchies here. I've had an engagement with the Defense Secretary I've had an engagement with a Navy commander. And what I can tell you is that it's an extraordinary sense of purpose. They are strategic thinkers. I've met the Defense Secretary, a great strategic thinker, very aware of the threats that we are facing, very aware and strategically aligned civil military leadership. So I think that is something that is a great advantage. So I think what we can certainly see is that there's been great progress that has been made since the attack. So I think I want to start by acknowledging that great progress that has been made, and I think that's very, very important. I think when it comes to terror attacks, there's always lessons to be learned. I think that is something that, if I think of the United Kingdom, for instance, of the Manchester bombings, there were great failures there also. And I think it's important to realize that obviously every society will always invariably have vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities are inherently built into society, and those are the vulnerabilities that terrorist actors are aiming to, in a sense, exploit. And when they do exploit them, there's always lessons to be learned. And I think the sense that I'm getting here is that there's a great willingness to learn the lessons. There's a great willingness to improve the strategic nature of the institutions, to have the civil and the military leadership aligned in purpose to keep the country safe. And I think in terms of intelligence, what we need to pursue, and I think in a sense that's also maybe one of the things that I can bring what we've learned in Europe, if you will, that is a sense of cooperation between countries that is very, very important. In Europe, over a number of different years, we've started to build infrastructure for that. We've started to build institutions, whether that is supranational agencies such as Europol, whether that is institutions and criminal justice measures like the European arrest warrant, which in Europe has really fundamentally changed the nature of how we deal with extradition nowadays in a very, very different ways. I think these are all the kind of instruments that perhaps are not always workable. I'm not suggesting that South Asia should develop the exact same instruments, but what I'm saying is that cooperation, intelligence sharing, and all of the kind of necessary cooperation between countries is of utmost importance. And the sense and purpose that I got when I spoke to the leadership here was very much that they're very aware of that, and that they're very, very much seeing the importance of cooperation, and that they are not perceiving that as a kind of a loss of sovereignty, as it were, but rather as a gain in terms of productivity, efficiency, and a gain in keeping everybody safer.
You mentioned similar failures in Europe too. You mentioned about certain tools, instruments that were used to bring about concrete or maybe improved communication and intelligence sharing. But what reform, restructuring from a political side did you see? Because here in Sri Lanka, we really did see the weakness, the breakdown of the linkage between the political authority and intelligence with the information at hand on what was about to happen. So were there any restructuring or reform in your understanding that were implemented?
Yes, so if I come back to the European example, certainly after 9/11 there was a great sense of shock and grief at the time. And to be honest, if we look at European counterterrorism, a lot of what had been done prior to 9/11 in a lot of ways was not super efficient and super effective. Just to give you an example, in Europe, just before 9/11, only 5 out of 28/27 EU member states even defined terrorism as a crime in their national legislation. So that is the first problem to begin with. If I'm to look at which groups were even classified as terror groups, the only group prior to 9/11 that was classified as a terror group was ETA.
Sri Lanka had to campaign, advocate to have proscribed or to have terrorist organizations proscribed in the EU when Sri Lanka was fighting a 3-decade war in the country. So again, when we talk about terrorism, Islamist extremist movements were new to the Sri Lankan society, at least.
Yes, I think what it points to, if you will, is that prior to 9/11, certainly there wasn't a deep understanding within European societies and political system to really mobilize against the terrorist threat that there was. And I think what you are pointing at is, in a sense, a symbol of that. I think there's many other symbols that we can also mention. I'll just give you another example where for many, many years, ETA terrorists were given asylum status. ETA terrorists that were fleeing from Spain were given asylum, refugee status in France and in Belgium and in other countries, and were often perceived to be freedom fighters. Now, while you might understand that from the historical beginnings, where they were perhaps fighting against the fascist dictatorship that was the Franco regime in Spain at the time, subsequently Spain became a democracy with a constitution, with a protection of human rights and so on. And it was still quite difficult to make those changes while there was still this perception of freedom fighting. 9/11 changed a lot of those things inside the European Union, certainly when it came to a number of different terror groups, where there was now an understanding that we can no longer deal with terror groups in the same way as we used to deal with them. And the European arrest warrant was, in a sense, well, there's two main instruments that really followed. The first one was a European definition of what terrorism is. To this day, the European Union is the only international organization that has a legally agreed definition of what terrorism is. The United Nations at this point does not have one, and I know a number of UN member states are campaigning to have one also at the UN level. The European Union achieved one, and that really changed the dynamic in the sense that out of 5 EU member states that used to define terrorism as a crime, we now have every single EU member state that defines terrorism as a crime. And then the second thing was the European arrest warrant that really made a sort of situation that I mentioned just earlier in terms of extraditing ETA terrorists, let's say from France back to Spain, really revolutionized them. I'll give you one example, one very pertinent example, that is the failed bombing in London of 21st of July. You will remember the 7/7 bombing in London. 2 weeks after that, there was a failed terror attack on London where the attacker then fled London and was reaching the shores of Italy. And in a normal environment where the European arrest warrant doesn't exist, the whole extradition procedure would have been one of perhaps 10, 15 years, perhaps unsuccessful at the end in terms of extraditing. Now, in this particular case, thanks to the European arrest warrant, the suspect was apprehended and was handed over to the British authorities in a matter of weeks, not in a matter of years, but in a matter of weeks. And I think that's the important aspect. Countries need to work together in order to do that. I think what you were mentioning earlier in terms of the Sri Lankan government campaigning, I think that is a failure that unfortunately is part of our history, but that is something that shouldn't define our future in terms of how we collaborate together.
You spoke about collaborate. I'd like to speak about intelligence collaboration going forward. But before that, how real is the threat for South Asia as a breeding ground for extremist or fragmented extremist groups and regrouping of these groups? And what should South Asian states be cautious about or be proactive in order to eliminate them at ground level?
Yes, the threat is very, very real. The threat is there, and it is something that ultimately you can't eliminate the threat because it's an ever-evolving and ever-continuing to exist threat. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily that it is a bigger threat in South Asia than it might be, let's say, in Europe or in other parts of the world. But what you have is this new environment where increasingly actors radicalize, as I mentioned. They radicalize partially remotely, they radicalize through the internet, they radicalize in disenfranchised communities, and that is something that needs to be continuously monitored. You need to invest in intelligence training, you need to invest in counterterrorism training, you need to invest in your forces to be able to deal with that, because what is required here is not only an investigation. You need to really, in a sense, prevent, because ultimately that's what we want with terror attacks, isn't it? We want to prevent them. We don't want to investigate ex post after the actual attack. We want to ensure that the attack doesn't happen. Now, I think here, in order to ensure that it doesn't happen, you need to have the capabilities in place, you need to have well-trained professionals that are able then to detect those activities through online spaces, through gaming and a number of other kind of methods of communication that increasingly radicalize youngsters, and to be open as to the ideology that you might be looking for. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we might not have a coherent unitary ideology that we're looking for in terms of radicalization. There may be elements of different ideologies that may be used to radicalize youngsters, and that is something that, in a sense, we all need to be vigilant. In a sense, the state needs to provide the capabilities, but ultimately society as a whole that needs to remain vigilant, because without societies, without the mothers, without the families, without the employers, without the schools, without, in a sense, all the kind of societal bonds that everybody has, it's very difficult in the end for those things to remain undetected. And when everybody comes along and helps, I think it's a much better chance of defeating it in the end.
More on Sri Lanka, why do you think, in your understanding and research, Sri Lanka had become a breeding ground again for extremist elements, where they regrouped here, or there were newly radicalized young people who really took the ideology strongly forward?
Yes, I mean, in a sense, if you look at how the radicalization process works, you're looking at youngsters where there's an element of being dissatisfied with elements of societies, being part of a narrative where you're either disenfranchised in terms of your rights, where you don't feel like you fully belong into society. And those are the kind of fault lines that exist in every society, ultimately. And every society has societal fault lines. But the societal fault lines are where, in a sense, terrorist groups can then come in and use those societal fault lines in order to then radicalize youngsters. And obviously, being a country that has only come out of what was a very painful experience, with lots of lessons and with lots of understanding of the situation, nonetheless, fault lines continue to exist in every society. And I think that's where then you have the possibility for radicalization in those societal fault lines.
I think it's time we take a short break here at Hydepark on Derana 24. We are in conversation with Professor Christian Kaunert of the University of South Wales International Centre for Policing and Security Studies. We'll be right back after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. We are in conversation with international security and counterterrorism expert Professor Christian Kaunert of the International Centre for Policing and Security Studies of the University of South Wales, joining us here at Hydepark. As we speak about intelligence and counterterrorism, not just in South Asia, but a global network of shared intelligence. How would you say the wave of extremist elements are really taking over our countries? What trends do you see? Where is it coming from? And where is it going to? What are they really thinking? I was just looking at your profile, Professor. You are a distinguished professor at the School of Behavioral Forensics. I understand you do extensive research into what these extremists are thinking, what ideologies are embedded, and what leads to the harmful decisions that they take.
Yes, no, I think that is very important. I mean, historically, we know that a lot of terrorist groups have acted from Afghanistan. We now have a certain government in power that was at the heart of supporting some of those groups. And of course, that provides opportunities for actors that are operating also out of Afghanistan. We know similar things also acting out of Pakistan. I mean, we just had a number of terror attacks recently. So we know that certain groups are also supported by Pakistan, so this is a concern. We also know more globally that we've seen hybrid terrorist activity that comes out of Gaza, of course, in Palestine. We see Iranian-sponsored terror groups that are also operating in a number of different ways that are increasingly also linked to some of the indigenous terrorist groups. So that is something that we can also see. So we see really a larger network of different terror groups that are operating more or less out of different corners of the world. None of them primarily based here, of course, but with the potential and the not too far geographical distance to perhaps at some point pose a security risk also here. This, in addition to the, in a sense, the intersection that increasingly occurs. We have an intersection between counterterrorism, an intersection with hybrid warfare and disinformation campaign, and that is something that we really need to watch out for in the future. I think here in particular the ideology that I mentioned and the possibilities of the technology that are increasingly there in terms of AI usage, in terms of the possibility of creating entirely fake videos, the possibility of creating fake videos, fake pictures, gives us the possibility to create fake events, events that never occurred, events that could potentially be used as precipitating events for terrorist radicalization. And I think that's where it's so important.
To instill a sense of revenge?
Exactly.
Or even,
Exactly. To give this sense of grief, because you can use AI and that technology in order to create a sense of grief amongst a certain segment of the population, a sense of feeling disenfranchised, slowly but surely, making people in a sense feel more isolated, feeling more disenfranchised from society as a whole. And then when you have a number of people that are already thinking this particular way, you can create fake events, fake precipitating events that could then potentially create terror attacks out of revenge, if you will.
So this also means the intelligence, security, defense mechanism or counterterrorism efforts need an upgrade from traditional approaches. So is there a focus in the EU to give more training in new technology, AI, to counter the potential threats that we are talking about, and how can we really bring that here?
Yeah, I think that is very, very important. I think it is something that increasingly is being realized in Europe, that we are at the mercy of some of those new technological developments, and we have to, in order to stop a terror attack, you need to be one step ahead of the terrorist, not one step behind the terrorist. And I think that is very, very important to underline here. And we are aiming to achieve that. We are aiming to bring that into our training more and more. I think collaboration is important, but equally it's a kind of a baseline understanding of the threats that is also important, a baseline understanding of the possibilities, capabilities of terrorist actors that are ever increasing. And I think that is something that is of a concern, the possibility not only in the technological sphere, but the possibility also in the chemical and biological sphere, where we know that some terror groups have been trying to get also chemical and biological weapons for a number of years. So that is something that we also have to continue to monitor, and the intersection between the technology, the chemical and also the biological and the capabilities.
It's definitely something important to discuss, but why has South Asia really failed in intelligence sharing compared to the Europe or the Middle East region? I understand you've done research on EU-India intelligence sharing, but why is South Asia particularly weak or loose in intelligence sharing?
I think for various historical and political reasons, of course, intelligence sharing is seen in a slightly different way. And I'm saying that from the point of view that intelligence sharing is always difficult. Intelligence sharing relies a lot on trust, ultimately. It relies on trust in terms of what is being done with the intelligence that is being shared. Is that leading to a terror attack being avoided? Is that leading to perhaps to embarrass the agency that has shared that? So there's a lot of different trust mechanisms that need to be built. And those trust mechanisms, they don't just occur, you know, they have to be actively nurtured. They need to be embedded in a larger institutional framework that nurtures those trust mechanisms, because ultimately without that sense of trust and without that sense of cooperation, it's very, very difficult to share intelligence that really goes at the heart of keeping everybody safe. So when people sometimes don't feel like sharing intelligence, usually it is out of good reasons, because they want to, in a sense, keep people safe. But sometimes, in order to keep people safe, you need to share in order to ensure that that information reaches the right level. And that, for that, you need those kind of trust-building mechanisms that are vital.
In a country like Sri Lanka, still healing from the wounds of post-conflict and even post-Easter attacks, the most recent situation that Sri Lanka faced. How do you think this kind of counter-terrorism efforts, or Sri Lanka can balance, or society can balance those hard counter-terrorism efforts and the prevention of these in a situation as vulnerable as ours?
Yes. So firstly, let me start by saying that actually coming out of my various engagements, I have very good faith that the responsible political leadership and military leadership understands the vulnerabilities very well. They've talked to me about that and they've discussed it with me, and I have a very good sense that they understand the kind of threats that Sri Lanka faces. And I think that's very, very reassuring, and I think that's a really very positive message that I can give. In order to continuously counter that, I think, as I pointed out, you need to continuously invest. You need to continuously align the message to keep society in an alignment, if you like, with the leadership, to keep the fault lines that invariably are going to exist in every society. You try and keep them as low as you possibly can in order to not, in a sense, inflame certain fault lines that are always going to exist and that society has to live with them in the long run. And I think that's the important part. Ultimately, every society can deal with that only when it brings the political military leadership together with societal demands, together with societal trends, and then ultimately prevents those kind of activities to occur.
There are concerns about regional or extremist groups that are reawakening or regrouping. So to what extent should Sri Lanka look outward in intelligence sharing, cooperation, and also building a network,
I think,
not just within South Asia?
Yes, I think the network dimension is an important one. Intelligence sharing is important, but the network, it's building a good network of friends, if you like, a network of friends that look out for you, a network of friends that you look out for. Sri Lanka is in an excellent situation because it is a very centrally and strategic location in the Indian Ocean. It has an excellent relationship with its neighbors. It has very, very many cultural ties, for instance, to India, cultural, historical ties to India. All of those dimensions are really dimensions that you can build on in terms of developing those trust mechanisms that I was speaking about earlier, that you can really, and I attended also the Goal Dialogue, and I think I was very impressed here at the exceptional organization and as the responsible convener that Sri Lanka showed itself for the Goal Dialogue. And what really came out here very well is the kind of network that Sri Lanka is building already, that Sri Lanka is at the heart of the region, and with the ability to reach out to all neighbors and to all partners. And I think that's a very important message to bring, because ultimately it is important to build that level of rapport with all of your partners, with all of your neighbors. And I think institutions like the Goal Dialogue are a very important institution, a strategic institution, in order to really build that kind of level of trust that is necessary to facilitate that protection from those security threats.
We've been talking about radicalization and counter-terrorism efforts. How do you look at the global order today? World wars, or at least wars among countries across the globe, really threatening security of our part of the world as well. So what's your understanding here?
Yes, so the global order is more complex than what we've ever seen before. I think that's the starting point. We are seeing a kind of shift that used to be, if we're looking at the times of the Cold War, we had a kind of duopoly between the United States and the Soviet Union. Then we had a unipolar moment where perhaps the United States was primarily dominating. We've started to shift away from that. We're starting to see a kind of a messy, multipolar order. I don't know whether we're quite there yet in terms of multipolar order, but we're certainly in the dimension of messiness. And that's a kind of a vulnerability in a way as well, because what we're seeing is this kind of slight incoherence in terms of power structures needs really regional powers and needs global powers to step up and to be able to provide the level of security that is necessary. We're seeing responsible partners here. I've met many responsible partners here in Colombo that are trying to in a sense, achieve that. But as the world transitions, and here the war in Ukraine is a very, very dangerous moment. Of course, we've seen also wars in the Middle East that are also with the potential to ignite a global conflict, and that is something that we need to work on in order to prevent. This is something that we really need to work on very hard, because to come to the suggestion about possible world wars, I hope very much that when my children see this, they will know that we will do everything that we can in order to prevent any moves towards a world war. But when we see more and more regional conflicts, the risk is always there that those conflicts eventually become aligned. And when they do become aligned, that's when we move towards global conflict. Now, I hope very much, and we're all working towards the fact that this never happens, and that nobody will ever have to worry about that, hopefully. But it is something that we continuously have to work on. It isn't something that happens by magic, that those insecurities just go away.
Finally, what role do small states or even mid-states as Sri Lanka have in this situation that we're seeing globally? Also, a location as Sri Lanka, which attracts the influence of global powers, superpowers who see Sri Lanka as a geopolitical strategic location. Sri Lanka is strategically location, of course, in terms of a maritime hub, logistical hub. But apart from that, how do you see Sri Lanka's role here?
Yes, I would go that Sri Lanka is a little bit bigger than calling it a small state. I think it's a vital state here in the Indian Ocean. As I mentioned, 70% of world trade that goes through Colombo port. A central strategic location, close links to its neighbors. It is a very important stabilizer in the region. I think that is really important message that also came out of the Goal Dialogues. I think that this stabilization role is a very important one, this openness to have different partners, this openness to be to partner up with different partners in the world, whether that is in a region, to balance perhaps against the global power competition, if you will, to stabilize the system so that the global power competition does not get out of hand, so that we remain in a stable scenario, and to be able to, in a sense, any kind of disturbance, if you will, that is felt here in Colombo, any disturbance that will have ripple effects. It will have ripple effects on the Middle East. It will have significant effects on Europe. So this is how perhaps a smaller but more medium-sized state such as Sri Lanka really has an important role to play to stabilize the situation so that we don't end up in that type of situation.
Thank you very much for your time here at Hyde Park on the Derana 24, and I'm sure you'd share these insights with the rest of the world too as you travel back to Ireland.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We were in conversation with Professor in International Security and Counterterrorism Studies, Professor Christian Kaunert, the Director for International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales, Professor of International Security at the Dublin City University of Ireland, and also a distinguished professor at the School of Behavioural Forensics at the National Forensic Sciences of the University, India. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park on other Derana. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.